Hello everyone, welcome to discussion week 6. So this week we're gonna talk more about producer surplus, demand, supplier surplus, and also tax revenue. So the main topic is consumer surplus, CS, producer surplus, PS, tax revenue, TR. That we lost. So we look at the case that we don't have any tax yet. So that's the basic case. That's the most classical case, right? Let me remind you the supply and demand curve. By this point, you should be it should come in natural. Okay, you should every time we talk about supply and demand curve, you should literally just know how to draw it out in your mind. Have a downward sloping demand curve. Demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, and we label everything clearly. Price and quantity, and the intersection of supply curve and demand curve gives us the equilibrium, right? And corresponding quantity is the equilibrium quantity, and corresponding price is the equilibrium price. And this is the basic supply and demand curve. But in this case, we know that it's a little bit impossible for us to calculate the supply curve. Producer surplus, consumer surplus, right? Because there is no areas yet. So we extend it, we do a little modification. And as you can see, if you extend the demand curve and supply curve, it will eventually give us a region. But why don't we usually draw out the intersection? Well, because technically the intersection doesn't make economic sense, right? So basically, if you look at this intersection, it says when price equals to 0, suppliers demanders or buyers want a certain amount of goods of this, but doesn't make any sense. If it's free, you shouldn't have a limit of how much this good you want, right? Because it's free, so you should want as many as possible. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make economic sense. We usually don't draw it out. And I think you should remember, right? Because this curve is actually a modified version of this. Technically, when we introduce the supply and demand curve, it wasn't as smooth as this, right? It was maybe like a little bit change everywhere, and eventually we made it as smooth as possible, right? But anyway, you know that it probably doesn't make economic sense, but it's going to help us to calculate supply and consumer and the producer supplies. Usually in a test, we will probably give you an equation and ask you to calculate. Maybe in this setting, in this remote setting, it's gonna be impossible for us to ask you to draw out this supply and demand curve, but it's still possible that for us to ask you maybe calculate the supply and demand curve. Consumer and the producer supplies based on what the equation will give you. Let's look at an example. Say it's a whatever random good, okay? It's a good, and the supply curve is given by quantity equals to 4 price minus 80. And demand curve equals to 100, quantity demand equals to 100 minus 2p. And these numbers are just randomly chosen. As long as I can guarantee that the supply curve is upward sloping, which is here, and 4p, which so is upward sloping, and demand curve is downward sloping. You can modify the numbers and give yourself more examples as you want, as long as you can make sure that supply curve is upward sloping and demand curve is downward sloping. Okay. And in this case, we'll give you two equations, and first we want to draw out, or at least, I don't think anybody can, maybe you can, but I think an easier step is always to draw the supply and demand curve and calculate consumer and producer supplies based on the graph first, because visual is easier, right? So we know that when we can draw the curves first. So we know that when price equals 0, the demand curve is going to be at 100. Right? Because based on the equation we give you, when we set price equals 0, the quantity for demand curve is going to be 100, because 100 minus 2p, which is 100 minus 0, equals to 100. So when price equals 0, people want 100 of this good, and we now found one point of this curve. And the other point is we want to find the intersection of the demand curve with the axis, right? So we want 100 minus 2p equals 0. And you probably learned it from calculus or from your high school, whatever, middle school, and p equals to 50, right? So we find another point of this curve. When p equals to 50, quantity equals to 0. Now we have 2 points, we connect them. And this is demand curve, right? And similarly, we find the supply curve. We want to find the intersection for supply curve, but it's impossible for us to find one end of that, right? But we can, because the supply curve is going to be upward sloping, and it's not going to intersect with any other axis. But we do know that one of the end is intersecting with the price axis, right? Or the y-axis in this case, and it's price. So we set quantity equals to 0 to see at what price that quantity that it can make the quantity equals to 0. That means 4p minus 80 equals to 0, p equals to 20, right? So this is 50, this is 20. And even though we couldn't guarantee the other end, but we can find the intersection with the demand curve, right? So we only need 2 points to draw the supply and demand curve. I mean, we only need 2 points to draw the curve, right? And now we have 1 point, and we only need another point, and we know there is no other intersection with the axis. But at least I have a downward sloping demand curve, so I can set QD equals to QS to find the equilibrium quantity and price, and which is going to give us some point maybe around here, around there, and wherever it is, it's going to give us 2 points, and we can find our supply curve, right? So let's see, quantity of demand equals to 100 minus 2p, and let's set it equal to the quantity of supply, 4p minus 80. So 6p equals to 180, p equals to 30. So when p equals to 30, what should be the quantities? We plug that number in, right? So 4p minus 80 equals to 4 times 30 minus 80, which equals to 40. And now we have 2 points for the supply curve, and we connect it. And it gives us the supply curve. And now, what we really want to find is not just draw the curves, right? What we really want to find is consumer surplus and producer surplus. And as the lecture video indicates, how do we decide which part is consumer surplus, and how do we decide which part is the producer surplus? Well, we use the equilibrium price as kind of like the division or divided part, or dividing point. Here. We already found out that the equilibrium price is 30. So we divide it from here. And whatever is above the price line, the equilibrium price line, there is no line. Technically, there is no line here, right? No line here. There's no line, but I'm just drawing it out. So it's easier for us to visually see which part is consumer surplus and which part is producer surplus, right? So I call it equilibrium price line, but you can call it whatever. And technically, there doesn't exist this kind of line. We're just drawing it out just to help us to decide which part is consumer surplus. So whatever is above this price line, but below the demand curve. This region is the consumer surplus. I use CS to represent it. And whatever is below the, maybe I should use the color green, say. Below the price line, but above the supply curve is the producer surplus. Why do all of these work to find out these two triangles, right? Because, well, now we have two triangles, and we do know that the formula for triangles area is 1/2 times the base times height, right? So it's easier for us to calculate now. But when I only give you two equations, which is supply curve and demand curve, it's probably gonna take a lot of like I don't know, if you only look at these two equations, it's probably gonna be harder for you to calculate. But now once we draw the graphs, it's just becomes so much easier. We want to calculate the consumer surplus. Well, the CS equals to, maybe not yellow, let me just use red so it's more obvious. The consumer surplus equals to, I already know this is the triangle I want. And what is the height? Well, it's 50 minus 30, right? So it's 20. And what is the base? We already know that the equilibrium quantity is 40, right? 40 minus 0, this is the base, right? Is 40. And we know that for the area of triangular, we have to times 1/2. And it should be 400, right? And similarly, we find it for the producer surplus. Still 1/2 times, it's 30 minus 20, which is 10, times 40 minus 0. It should be, sorry, 200. It should be 200, right? So that's basically how we're gonna ask you for producer surplus or consumer surplus question. And maybe we can have additional calculation to ask you for total surplus, right? Total surplus TS equals to CS plus PS. So in this case, if we ask you to calculate total surplus, it should be 400 plus 200, which equals to 600. And you can also use total surplus to double check if you did it correctly, because the total surplus is just the area of this entire big triangle, right? And you can calculate it again just to double check if you did it correctly. And the area is 50 minus 20. Total surplus 50 minus 20, that's the base. The height is 40, right? And we times 1/2. And equals to 600. So we did it correctly. And that's basically it. For a case that doesn't include tax, it's, well, maybe it's not super easy, but it's relatively easier for us to calculate, right? And then we can introduce the case that has tax in it. Still, we can draw the original supply and demand curve. And we can keep using the two equations, that's fine. And I already know the top half is the consumer surplus. The bottom half is the producer surplus. Right? This is the case that without tax. And now we impose a tax in this market. So still, this is a whatever random good, okay? And I don't want to specify a number yet. I just want to show you visually. Say there is a tax, whatever dollars it is, maybe X amount of dollars. And from 2 weeks ago, I already introduced, it doesn't matter which party is bearing the tax, right? Even though maybe consumers are paying the tax, but both parties are actually suffering, burden the tax together, take the tax together. And I remember 2 weeks ago, I introduced the way that we can shift the curve, even though we know that it's not a shift because it's a change of a price, right? Tax is technically a change of price, so it should be just a movement. But 2 weeks ago, I said maybe we can, for simplicity reason, we want to first just kind of shift it around to make the change more visual. But now after 2 weeks, you should be getting familiar with the materials, and let's go back to the movement, okay? And I don't know what color, maybe purple, whatever. Say there's a tax, and now we move the point along the curve, and this is how much the buyer is paying. We use PB to represent us. The corresponding quantity is the quantity after tax, right? And the intersection with the supply curve is the price that suppliers actually get, right? This should be all familiar to you at this moment now. So as you can see, it's not a whole triangle anymore. There is a rectangle here. What is this part, right? If you already watched lecture videos, you should know that this is the tax revenue. Oh, maybe I'm slightly ahead of the progress yet. Progress of the lecture materials. Maybe just slightly, but I think you should understand this already. Oh, maybe no. Let me see the lecture videos. Because on my end, I see that the lecture videos is posted for lecture 11. But that's... well, I think you probably will understand it, maybe in the lecture 2. So let me just continue with it, just briefly kind of talk about it, because otherwise I wouldn't have any other materials to cover. Where am I? Oh, okay. So, what is this? What is this rectangular? Well, I already know that this is the price that paid by producer. Paid by buyer, and this is the price that is received by supplier. So what is the price? What's the difference between the supplier's paying price? A buyer's paying price and supplier's receiving price. It should be tax, right? So this part is tax. So tax per good times the entire quantity. What should that be? Well, it should be tax revenue, right? After all, the government is charging the tax for the sake of collecting money, right? So this part is the tax revenue. But now, once we impose a tax, I actually have a smaller amount of consumer surplus, right? Because I already said that the consumer surplus is above the price line, but below the demand curve. But in this case, the price line is not the original P star anymore, but it's the PB. And the new, it's gonna get messy, but I'll try my best to. The new consumer surplus becomes a smaller region, right? Maybe it's not that obvious, but I'm trying my best. This new consumer surplus is less than the original consumer surplus. And as you can see from the visual, part of it goes to taxes, right? And there is a tiny little bit left here that we couldn't specify that yet. We don't know what that is, and apparently it's not in tax revenue. Don't worry, it is. And similarly for the case of producers, originally it was below the price line and above the supply curve, right? But now the new price line is the PS because they only receive PS, right? So it's below the price line and above the supply curve. It's the new PS. And this is also less than the original PS, right? So both consumers and buyers, both consumers and suppliers, they actually receive less. And we know that part of the consumer surplus and part of the producer surplus goes to tax revenue. So it's understandable, right? It's intuitive, right? So if we impose a tax, then it must come from somewhere. It's money, right? And this money comes from, well, partially from the consumers and partially from the suppliers. And just like we mentioned 2 weeks ago, once we impose a tax, it's not just the consumers or suppliers bear the tax on their own, but it's both parties take the tax together, right? But then still, we left this tiny little bit that unspecified. We don't know where it is now. It's definitely not in the producer surplus, right? Because it's not below the price line anymore. The new price line is PS, but it's not below the price line. But it should be the producer surplus. Originally, it was in the producer surplus, but it's not, and it's not there anymore, and it's not in the tax revenue because the tax revenue is a rectangular, and it's not part of that, right? And just like I mentioned for this consumer surplus, same problem happened here too. We couldn't specify this area. We don't know what that is. We don't know where that surplus where that surplus goes. It's not in the tax revenue. It's not in the producer surplus. It's not in the consumer surplus. Then where it is? Well, it's just simply a loss. It's simply a loss. Nobody's getting this part of the surplus. Not consumers, not producers, but not government. So when we impose a tax, government collects tax revenue, but not fully, right? Because there is a loss for the surplus that if there is no tax, the society can get more as a whole, because producers can get a little bit more, suppliers can get a little bit more, and also there is no loss. But now, once we impose the tax, producers get less, and consumers get less, and there's also a loss that nobody's getting that, not even the government, right? But again, I'm not saying that to make tax sound bad. As once you learn more, you will know actually tax is doing great, and as long as we use tax revenues to generate social programs and generate social benefits that is greater than that we lost, tax can do a lot more than what we can imagine. Okay, so tax is a good thing, but just simply in this case, for now, it looks like, oh, wait a second, it's creating loss, and what are we gonna do with the tax, right? Well, it should be really clear that once we use tax in a better way, then we can have better results for the society. But I really just don't want to make you feel like, oh yeah, based on the graph, seems like tax is the bad thing, and the only thing it does is to create a loss. But again, this is only a very basic, simple model. This is not taking into account of like other factors. So don't just simplify that. Oh, tax is bad because of this graph. No, it's not. Okay. But anyway, once we impose the tax based on this graph, consumers get less consumer surplus and producers get less producer surplus, and we create a deadweight loss for the entire market. And that should be it for today. And of course, you can also calculate that. In this case, I didn't specify the tax money, how much of the tax, but we can definitely try, right? If we still use the same number, 50, 30, 20. This is 50, this is 30, this is 20. And the number is 40 here. Well, we can definitely impose the numbers there, but maybe just, I don't know. Say maybe the tax is $10. Okay, and we can just simply specify some numbers here. Maybe after $10, and we actually can use the equation. So now buyers pays. Where's my equation? Demand curve is 100 minus 2p. And yeah, maybe not in this case. Maybe we should specify some numbers instead of just calculating everything. Oh, yeah, maybe I can say the tax is $10 and producers paying 35 in this case. Wait, let me check the slope. It's 102p, 4p, so technically the supply curve is more elastic, so maybe 40. Maybe 38. And this is 28. So the supplier is receiving 28 and the buyers are paying 38, and 38 minus 28 is $10, so tax is $10, okay? And in this case, technically I can calculate the exact number here. Now I have the price, I can plug it in, but it's gonna be too much work. So let me just specify some random number, maybe let's say 30. But technically I should, because I already said dollar. I already set the price to be 38, so I can plug the number back in. But never mind that. Let's just pretend that we calculate 30. Then now, the tax revenue should be very easy to calculate, right? Because we know that the tax revenue is the tax per good is 10, and we have 30 goods that is being purchased. So the tax revenue is 300 in this case. And for the producer surplus, it should be 28 minus 20 times height. Height in this case is the tax, right? The tax in this height, the height in this case is the amount after tax, right? So it's 30. And times 1/2. So it's 120. And consumer surplus equals to 1/2 times. In this case is 50 minus 38 times 30, right? So it's 180. And we can add everything together just to see if we're correct about the deadweight loss, because now we should have a total last surplus, right? So in this case, it's 120 plus 180 plus 300, which equals to... Wait a second, I think I did something wrong. Yeah, maybe the quantity should be even less. Maybe around 20 or something. Then the numbers should be correct. But anyway, you get the idea that you just what if we're giving you a test on the that will I mean if we were giving you a problem on the that will loss, we probably will specify the number so you don't need to go through all of this hassle, because right now I'm just trying to think of the questions right off my tab right off my head. So I probably made some mistakes here and there around the numbers, because this is not I wasn't trying to give you example for the that will loss yet. I was only trying to show you, but you should get the idea, and it's basically the same to calculate the consumer surplus and producer surplus. Once you have the numbers, it should be easy. And to calculate double loss, it's also the same, right? Because it's triangular, so you use the tax money, which is the base here, times height. The height is the difference between the original equilibrium quantity and the after-tax quantity, right? In this case, it's height and times 1/2, and that's how you get that will loss. But I think you probably, again, I'm not sure if it's just me, I couldn't see the new videos yet, or you also couldn't see that. So maybe you already learned it, maybe you haven't yet, but once you watch lecture videos, everything's going to become clear. I'm just trying to give you some examples that you may get tested on in the exam, okay? If you have any questions, please email me, and I know that I'm not being super clear if, this example specifically. If you want a specific example of how to calculate that with loss, just email me and I can give you one, okay? I can try to think of a question, all right? And that should be it. And I think the midterm 2 is coming up, I assume, and good luck on that. Maybe it's not this week, maybe it's next week. I'm not that sure, but yeah, I think it's approaching. But anyway, just prepare for these materials and you should be fine for the midterm 2. Well, good luck. I'll see you next week.